So good morning, everybody. We are ready to start with the panel number 5, Public-Private Partnerships for Development. I think it's a topic that will be of great interest today, especially taking into consideration the bleak socioeconomic global perspective and remembering that PPPs were actually brought up as one of very effective and possible solutions. So let's bring in a little bit of hope. And I'm passing it to Ivan Rebolledo.
Good morning. We're going to have a discussion on a technical topic, and I know this is the last session keeping all of you from lunch, so we'll be precise. Let me begin by making some framing remarks on PPPs. Our region has clearly infrastructure gaps and needs to invest at least 5% of GDP to cover its infrastructure needs, if not more. Numbers show that it is only currently investing half of that. Fortunately, it now seems that PPPs are becoming a popular financing tool once again. Until the late 90s, Latin America was the prominent region for public-private partnerships. However, investments plummeted due in part to the backlash of poorly implemented PPPs. Triggered by low commodity prices and rising fiscal deficits, as well as by improvements in PPP readiness, many countries have established dedicated agencies and strengthened regulations leading to increased PPP investments from approximately $8 billion in 2005 to $39 billion in 2016. In total, Latin America and the Caribbean has seen investments of $361.3 billion in around 1,000 PPPs in infrastructure projects in just a decade, mostly in the energy and transport sectors. The potential usefulness of PPPs is clear. They help overcome limitations for public provisions, inefficiencies, lack of technical skills, slow procurement processes, and budget constraints. But they also raise concerns, such as large-scale projects pose many risks, including technical, financial, environmental, and social issues. PPPs demand a greater focus on risk allocation, dispute resolution, and analysis of whether they offer good value for money. They also require institutional developments that take time to consolidate, which if done poorly can result in higher costs and fewer services. Moreover, transparency is key to mitigate corruption risks. We are fortunate to have a very good panel today. We'll be hearing first from Krishnan Sharma, Chief of the Strategic Engagement Unit at the Office for Financing for Development at the United Nations. And our panelists in the following order will be José Manuel Vassallo, Professor at the Universidad Politécnica de Madrid, followed by Laura Abreu, who's a specialist on educational policies and multi-sectoral initiatives. And lastly, Martin Chrisney, Senior Director for International Development Assistance Services Institute at KPMG. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Krishnan, who's going to talk to us for a few minutes. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ivan. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me to such an interesting forum. So I'm going to speak on the issue of PPPs and sustainable development, the issues, implementation, principle, and guidelines. So as was mentioned, PPPs can be seen as very important. The work that we do in the Financing for Sustainable Development Office is really about financing the SDGs. And really, our work is centered around something called the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which was signed by UN member states in 2015. So our work recognizes the importance of PPPs as one tool that can sort of help address this infrastructure gap. Just one out of many tools, to be sure. And it can be an important tool to leverage in private finance into infrastructure projects. At the same time, PPPs can also pose challenges. And generally, our work also takes into account and cautions against over-relying on them, and cautions on the need to be very careful in terms of their implementation and their selection. I'll go into these issues in greater detail in my presentation. Sure. So I'll start by very briefly describing the roles of the public and private sector in financing infrastructure, just very brief. And then the heart of the presentation will be the following sections, assessing their sustainable development impact and ways to enhance the implementation of PPPs, including having common international standards and guidelines. So looking at the infrastructure gap, as we know, if you look at the 2030 Agenda and SDGs, addressing the infrastructure gap would entail sort of trillions of dollars on an annual basis. And in developed economies, there's a significant difference between developed and developing economies. In developed economies, already about 2/3 of infrastructure is financed by the private sector, and 1/3 by the public sector. But the opposite is the case for developing economies. Within developing economies itself, the private sector's participation in infrastructure is limited. A lot of the recent increase has been in upper middle income countries and has been particularly restricted to certain sectors, in particular electricity, but also natural gas, transport, and communications. So I have some charts here that illustrate it, and illustrate in particular the focus on upper middle income countries. So once again, PPPs are not a panacea all across the board. They are more suited to certain countries and certain sectors, as will be illustrated. But having said that, once we assess their impact, how useful have they been? How successful have they been? What is their role going forward? We have to be very cautious and recognize certain caveats. The first caveat is that a lot of the analysis undertaken on PPPs is focused really on developed countries. As of now, as mentioned earlier, private finance constitutes only just a small portion of infrastructure finance in developing countries. But even if you look at developed countries itself, PPPs themselves have yet to become a major catalyst of investment there. They account for less than 5% of infrastructure investment in most OECD countries, and even in countries where they're most widespread, like Australia, only about 10%. So that being said, let's look closer at what deems a PPP to be successful. From a public policy perspective, the prime objective should be an improvement in the quality and efficiency of a given service, net of cost. The term often used here is value for money, which takes into account the cost of the PPP and the quality of service. There are two facts that need to be mentioned here. Firstly, when we think of value for money, it's important that we think about it in broad terms. The quality of service should include also, that's what we argue, in fact, sustainability considerations, economic and social impact, beyond just pure efficiency. And the cost should take into account not just the current cost, but potential future fiscal liabilities. So we need to look at value for money in a broad sense. At the same time, value for money is really a relative term. It's calculated, do PPPs generate greater value for money against the alternative of public sector provision? That's the calculation. And we have to be a little careful there, because it's still a relative measure. What it can mean so often is that in certain countries where the public sector is very weak and public provisions are very poor, those countries could show very high value for money. But as will be argued later, you need a strong public sector, in fact, to implement PPPs. So there could be a significant adverse selection problem here too. So the term has to be applied very carefully and looked at in a broad sense. Now, if you look at the evidence, the costs and benefits of PPPs, in general, the evidence has been not really favorable. They have tended to be, in general, more expensive than the alternative of public procurement. And the gains in service provision have not always been realized. But that being said, the point to be stressed is that these are not necessarily a problem with PPPs per se. They're often a problem with the way PPPs have been implemented. So these limited results should not be used to argue against PPPs, but rather look more carefully at ways to enhance their implementation. If you look carefully at the research findings, they sort of illustrate that they're more effective in certain sectors like economic infrastructure and less so in social sectors where they have failed to capture a number of the externalities that are involved there. But even in those viable sectors, it's important that countries have an enabling institutional framework that enables them to create, manage, and evaluate PPPs. And this brings us to the issue of enhancing the implementation of PPPs. We often speak about, there's a paper we've published on it, and we speak there about three particular factors. Firstly, trying to align PPPs with the principles contained in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. Secondly, having an institutional framework for PPPs. And thirdly, at an international level, developing common standards and guidelines. I won't spend much time on the Addis Agenda, but we go through a whole set of principles, including accountability, sharing risks and rewards fairly, having mechanisms that ensure that environmental and social effects get taken into account, and so on. And affordability, too. But moving on to the issue of having an enabling institutional framework for PPPs at the national level, we have sort of identified four broad factors here. Firstly, identifying and selecting projects. Let me take you here, it's probably easier to. Firstly, relating to project selection and implementation. Secondly, relating to contract formulation. Thirdly, having a transparent fiscal framework of fiscal accounting that enables one also to look forward and estimate possible contingent liabilities. And finally, taking into account social welfare issues, a legal and regulatory framework. And that's absolutely key. And all four of them are interrelated. Because the greater transparency you have, for example, on fiscal implications, that will also help you to structure contracts better. That will also help you to evaluate and identify PPPs. So they should be seen as holistically. And all of them, if evaluated properly, will give an appropriate value for money calculation. So what are the implications for the international community from this? And those implications, I would say, are about threefold. Firstly, in the case of developing countries, there's need for a lot of significant technical assistance in developing such a framework. And I would often stress that PPPs here are not suitable for all countries or sectors, and the first starting point should be to have a strong public sector. They should not be seen as a panacea, saying we have a weak public sector, let's get around it and bring in private finance. The first enabling condition should be to have a strong public sector. Then only will you have a proper and accurate value for money estimate. Secondly, there are a number of knowledge and analytical gaps relating to risk allocation, fiscal implications, and so forth, and that needs to be addressed. But thirdly, and I'll dwell on this just for a minute, is the need to develop international standards and guidelines in these and additional areas. And in particular, I really wanted to start really with the fiscal consequences of PPPs. The way countries treat sort of the fiscal implications of PPPs varies a lot. Certain countries like the UK and Australia follow certain established guidelines. And in the case of government-funded PPPs, they ensure that these are calculated on the balance sheet. Other countries do not. It's important to have clear guidelines which ensure that all countries follow a set of rules here, and ideally have PPPs on the balance sheet and not seen as an excuse for off-balance sheet activities. There are a number of other areas also where guidelines are important, like risk allocation, contract structuring, and so forth. Now, a lot of international organizations have been developing guidelines, and we commissioned a study in 2018 to really sort of look carefully at these guidelines and what could be the gaps in them. And there were a number of important sort of considerations which came in, including the need to take into account climate change considerations, the perspectives of non-commercial stakeholders in the PPPs, and also, I mean, you know, to have a better consideration of ESG issues, social, environmental, and governance issues as well. So there are a range of additional factors that need to be taken into account there. And UNECE, the UN Economic Commission for Europe, in fact, have tried to take on board a number of these considerations and promoted people-first PPPs. But having said that, those guidelines are really spread out across a range of international organizations, and it's important to try to pull together these threads. That's something that we're trying our best, and maybe have a common set of guidelines across all the international organizations to have some clarity and consistency here. So overall then, I mean, what we would say is that PPP should only be implemented in cases where they can be shown to provide value for money, but that term itself needs to be interpreted very carefully, understanding that it's a relative term. They should be aligned with the Addis Ababa principles, and two preconditions at the national level. At the national level in particular, they need to be backed by an enabling institutional framework where PPPs are applicable. And at the international level, it's very important to have a consistent and coherent set of guidelines. So, anyway, you know all about the Addis mandate, so I thank you for your kind attention.
Muchas gracias. Voy a hablar en español, al menos inicialmente, luego ya iremos viendo en el debate. En primer lugar, quería agradecer a los organizadores el invitarme a participar en este foro de grandísimo interés sobre un tema también de tremenda importancia, un tema, como se ha comentado, técnico, pero también con implicaciones políticas muy importantes. Yo querría empezar mi presentación haciendo referencia a que América Latina es una de las zonas del mundo, como se comentó ayer, que necesita un mayor crecimiento, expansión fiscal y mayor crecimiento del stock de capital público. Es cierto que estamos en un momento donde la economía está cambiando, cada vez tiene más importancia la economía digital, tiene más importancia aspectos medioambientales, pero la infraestructura sigue siendo necesaria. Por mucho que tengamos tengamos 5G, los contenedores hay que conectarlos entre el puerto y el ferrocarril, hace falta sistemas de transporte urbano, hace falta mejorar la calidad de vida en las ciudades y eso requiere inversión pública, ¿no? También vimos ayer cómo los déficits públicos de los estados de América Latina están creciendo, por lo tanto el modelo de PPP es un modelo que tiene que seguir vigente, ¿no? Una primera reflexión que quería mencionar es que el modelo PPP de Public-Private Partnerships es básicamente un instrumento. El objetivo final es desarrollar proyectos, bienes, servicios para el bien de la comunidad. A mí no me importa tanto, a nosotros no nos importa tanto si son PPP, si es Public Procurement. Lo que es cierto es que para desarrollarnos necesitamos una serie de bienes y de servicios. En la medida en que el país o los ciudadanos sean capaces de pagarlos y en la medida en que sean necesarios tenerlos cuanto antes. A mí a veces me sorprende mucho que el debate en este ámbito está en la línea de PPP versus Public Procurement y somos capaces de esperar años y años y años discutiendo cuando las personas están esperando para tener un sistema de transporte urbano, cuando hace falta un sistema de salud pública, cuando hace falta unos bienes que lo que tenemos que hacer es tenerlos cuanto antes porque son extremadamente necesarios. Y creo que es un primer tema, es decir, cuando algo es necesario hay que hacerlo cuanto antes y hay que buscar el método, por supuesto, mejor, pero teniendo en cuenta el coste de oportunidad que tiene el retrasar inversiones que son necesarias y que muchas veces no se tiene en cuenta en la balanza a la hora de valorar ese impacto. Y esto es muy importante en América Latina, porque en líneas generales Los países latinoamericanos, los gobiernos no tienen tanta capacidad de desarrollar infraestructura por ellos mismos como pueden tener países más desarrollados, ¿no? Bueno, como decía, las PPP son un instrumento que en sí mismo no es ni bueno ni es malo. Un martillo me puede servir para construir una casa o me puede servir para golpear a una persona, ¿no? Entonces, creo que es importante el evitar a veces, cosa que ocurre en muchos estudios, cuando un proyecto de PPP falla, parece que la culpa es del modelo PPP. Y dices, oiga, no necesariamente es así. En muchos casos se produce porque el proyecto no se ha elegido correctamente, porque se ha hecho rápido. Y esto además ocurre en el caso de las PPPs y no tanto en proyectos financiados por vía convencional por el sector público. O sea, a mí me llama la atención, al menos en mi país, en España, proyectos que ha financiado el sector público, se ha gastado muchísimo dinero, no son usados por casi nadie y nadie critica eso como el fracaso del modelo público convencional, ¿no? Sin embargo, las PPPs, como dan lugar a quiebras, dan lugar a renegociaciones, hay mucha transparencia en las cuentas, cosa que no ocurre con el ámbito del sector público, enseguida salen a la luz. Y si se analizan objetivamente, muchas veces no son tan problemáticos como originalmente parecen, ¿no? Por ejemplo, les pongo un caso, unas autopistas en Madrid, que son las autopistas radiales, en régimen de PPP, que han quebrado recientemente, han sido tremendamente criticadas y con mucha razón. Pero si al final analizamos qué ha pasado, lo que ha pasado es que el gobierno ha tenido que pagar la mitad de esas autopistas 10 años después de construirlas. O sea, ahí están las autopistas, ha costado la mitad del dinero que costó originalmente y encima se ha puesto 10 años después, ¿no? Entonces, es decir, muchas veces falta un poquito de tener en cuenta esos aspectos. Yo creo que es importante en ese sentido desarrollar metodologías. Se ha hablado antes de Value for Money, es una buena metodología, pero esas metodologías también tenemos que incluir algunos otros aspectos. Recientemente se está empezando a incluir ya la calidad de los servicios, que es algo muy importante y que las PPPs generalmente dan lugar a un mejor nivel de calidad, ¿no? Se me ocurre, por ejemplo, el caso de las prisiones en Chile, ¿no? Las prisiones en Chile, que se hicieron por sistema de participación público-privada, exigían una serie de requisitos al privado para cumplir con los principios generales de los derechos humanos que no cubrían las cárceles públicas, ¿no? Entonces, precisamente como esos estándares estaban fijados, el privado tiene que cumplirlos, ¿no? El problema es que los estándares que están fijados, el sector público tiene toda la libertad para no cumplirlos habitualmente, ¿no? Eso me comentaban también en Perú con el tema del mantenimiento de las carreteras. Me dijeron, la gran ventaja que tienen las PPPs es que garantizamos que las carreteras se van a mantener. Porque si lo hacemos por el sistema público convencional, sabemos que se construyen y después nadie las mantiene. Porque no hay incentivo político para mantenerla, sino para inaugurar nuevas obras, ¿no? Otro debate que creo que es importante abrir en estos procedimientos de valoración es el del coste financiero, ¿no? Es decir, una de las críticas fundamentales a las PPPs es que son mucho más caras que los proyectos públicos, porque el emitir deuda pública es más barato que el financiación privada. Pero también hay que tener en cuenta que esa contabilidad es un poquito engañosa, en el sentido de que los que financian el proyecto están estableciendo un spread al tipo de interés porque están asumiendo los riesgos de ese proyecto, cosa que no hace un país cuando emite deuda pública. Lo que está valorando es la capacidad que tiene el país de repagar la deuda pública con independencia de que el proyecto sea bueno o no. Si el proyecto es malo, dará lugar a una pérdida de costes para toda la sociedad que acabará repercutiendo en el coste de oportunidad de haber utilizado esos recursos de una manera más eficiente, ¿no? Bueno, y dicho estos temas, también quería apuntar, desde mi punto de vista, las PPPs tienen dos problemas fundamentales, ¿no? Algunos de ellos pues, ya han sido mencionados previamente por el ponente. Uno de ellos es la asimetría que existe entre los intereses del sector público y del sector privado, ¿no? O sea, la idea de fondo es decir, mire, Al final, si colaboramos, el sector público regula, defiende los intereses de la sociedad, el sector privado provee de eficiencia, de productividad. El problema que hay es que el sector privado tiene unos intereses económicos muy grandes y unos incentivos muy grandes porque su proyecto vaya bien para sus intereses. Y los funcionarios públicos muchas veces no tienen esos incentivos. Primero, porque no van a ganar más recursos por gestionar mejor. En muchos casos también porque la mejor estrategia que pueden seguir es la de no arriesgar nada y por lo tanto no dar los pasos necesarios para que el proyecto funcione correctamente, ¿no? En muchos casos también porque están poco tiempo y no están comprometidos, ¿no? Ese es uno de los aspectos importantes. Otro de los aspectos importantes de las PPPs es que los contratos, en muchos casos, al ser contratos de largo plazo, obligan a generar una serie de compromisos que a lo largo de los años no se adaptan a las necesidades que requiere la sociedad. Ahora mismo es muy importante determinados aspectos medioambientales, climáticos, que hace 20 años, cuando se firmó el contrato, ni siquiera se contemplaron, pero no por mala intención de nadie, sencillamente porque el contrato se fijó hace 20 años. Entonces, todo eso también, pues lo que requiere, y quizá con esto voy a acabar mi intervención, es que desde mi punto de vista el modelo de PPP es un modelo útil, es un instrumento útil, pero hay que perfeccionarlo, hay que mejorarlo constantemente. Y para ello es necesario ir a modelos de PPPs mucho más flexibles, ¿no? Por ejemplo, mediante instrumentos que permitan introducir variaciones en los contratos que puedan surgir, instrumentar mecanismos para poder, a lo largo de un periodo de tiempo, introducir cambios y que eso venga regulado ese procedimiento en el contrato original. También, en algunos casos, habrá que acudir más a una regulación independiente de algunos aspectos, ¿no? Porque en la práctica es muy difícil comprometerse en un periodo tan largo de tiempo a unos compromisos que pueden resultar ineficientes a lo largo del tiempo. También la posibilidad de que los gobiernos no sean capturados por el sector privado, que es algo muy normal, y por lo tanto puede existir una opción de recompra del contrato. Es decir, oiga, mire, si las cosas no las hemos hecho bien, que a veces es lo que ocurre, en lugar de tener que estar esperando 40 años o tener que ir a una litigación que al final va a ser costosísima, yo tengo una opción de recompra del proyecto. Me vuelvo a quedar con él y o bien lo gestiono yo personalmente como administración pública o lo vuelvo a lanzar adaptado a los nuevos tiempos, ¿no? Luego, un aspecto clave también es el replantear la asignación de los riesgos. Se ha visto que en muchos proyectos el riesgo de tráfico de demanda es incontrolable por el sector privado y debe ser, por lo tanto, gestionado de otra manera. Ahora enseguida termino. Luego, el sector público es clave que tenga una posición activa. En muchos casos el sector público, y es uno de los problemas, ha entendido las PPPs como un modo de olvidarse de los proyectos y dejarlos al sector privado. Y eso nunca funciona. Es clave, por tanto, y lo ha comentado previamente el ponente anterior, que exista una gobernanza extremadamente madura para que las PPP sean efectivas. Hace falta un sector público bien preparado, profundo, que crea en los proyectos, que participe en esos proyectos, que no los deje al albur de lo que quiera el sector privado. Y por mi parte, pues nada más. Luego ya en el debate podemos discutir algunos de estos temas.
Buenos días, muchas gracias por la invitación también. Yo voy a hablar un poquito desde una perspectiva más sectorial, desde el sector educación y quizás un poquito más de la experiencia previa que tengo de la República Dominicana. Cuando escuchaba al profesor Sharma y leí su paper ayer también, me preguntaba sobre las alianzas público y privadas a la hora de evaluar la eficiencia de las mismas. Algunos puntos que anotaba aquí, como la caracterización de las partes, precisamente un poquito de si ese sector privado está maduro, ese sector público, quién es que está gestionando el país, si el marco legal y los incentivos son los adecuados, y ayuda a fomentar y a facilitar esas alianzas público-privadas, cuáles son los intereses y las alineaciones que tiene cada uno de los sectores y si además están alineados en la misma solución de problemas, en la temporalidad. Y el talento y el conocimiento que requiere también las instituciones, esa composición. Por tradición, y también comentado por el profesor Sharma, las alianzas público-privadas que más éxito han tenido, y quizás por su demanda y por su forma de poder demostrar o medirlas o evaluarlas, han sido en obras de infraestructura, transporte y similares. En el sector educativo, específicamente, siendo un sector social, quizás es más difícil poder evaluar porque la complejidad del propio sector. De hecho, viéndome un ejemplo concreto, en República Dominicana yo me preguntaba con manera de reflexión, se ha llevado a cabo desde el 2013 a la fecha la mayor construcción de aulas escolares en los últimos 30 años, o sea, del 2013 a la fecha van como 15.000 y pico de aulas, y yo me preguntaba a manera de reflexión si esto no pudo haber sido quizá hecho en un modelo PPP, donde entonces ese cargo que hicimos al presupuesto de educación se pudiera haber dedicado a temas un poquito de más. Claro, las infraestructuras influyen, pero un poquito más hacia la calidad educativa y haciéndonos uso de un marco legal adecuado para llevar a cabo este proceso. Eso fue como a manera de reflexión, viéndolo desde el sector, y que pudo haber funcionado, no sabemos. Pero precisamente los proyectos sociales, los programas sociales son de mayor complejidad, sus evaluaciones involucran muchísimas más variables, y es precisamente ahí donde considero que hay que tener entonces más talento quizás y también conocimiento involucrar, porque es ahí donde se forma cultura, cambio, a mucho más largo plazo quizás posiblemente que algunos de los cambios que se puedan hacer a nivel de infraestructura. Yo creo que en el sector, específicamente en la República Dominicana, y entiendo que en otros países de Latinoamérica, el sector educativo es un sector muy participativo. Se involucra, opina, habla, es una característica del sector propiamente. Específicamente, por ejemplo, en la República Dominicana, desde los años 90 llevamos una participación, una creación de opiniones desde los planes decenales de educación, luego con la exigencia del movimiento del 4% por la educación, donde tuvimos una sociedad desde todos los sectores involucrada y exigiendo ese 4% del Producto Interno Bruto hacia la educación, que se logró con un compromiso social y político, un movimiento también multisectorial, que creó las bases de lo que fue luego esa alianza. Tenemos algunos temas puntuales, por ejemplo, esto llevó a la firma de un pacto educativo nacional, firmada en el 2015, también multisectorial. Con esto lo que quiero ir sentando las bases es de que yo creo que están las bases dadas, hay un terreno fértil donde los objetivos, por lo menos en este sector, están alineados, incluso en temporalidad, porque cuando se hizo la ley de la Estrategia Nacional de Desarrollo al 2030, se firmó el Pacto Educativo al 2030, ambos documentos también alineados con los Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible, o sea que digamos que a nivel de objetivo, a nivel de mesa de trabajo, a nivel de crear soluciones colaborativas en conjunto, multisectorial, en la República Dominicana y específicamente en el sector de educación, hay un terreno donde podría surgir mayores alianzas. Lo que pasa es que se ve como un poco tímidas esas para formalizarlas, entonces sigue apareciendo como si fuera una donación puntual del sector privado en un momento dado. Hay algunos ejemplos que se han venido dando, por ejemplo, con la educación técnico-profesional, que como está tan ligada al mercado de trabajo, entonces hay empresas, hay iniciativas puntuales de empresas que han aportado y han hecho alianzas desde el 2011 incluso, y que han dado muy buenos frutos en este sentido. Sin embargo, faltaría quizás recoger más data, sistematizar un poco más estas experiencias para ir viendo realmente el funcionamiento que van dando, lecciones aprendidas para bien o para mal. Luego hay otras iniciativas que han colaborado en ese sentido, por ejemplo, de transparencia. Ahí existe una iniciativa que se llama la Iniciativa Dominicana por una Educación de Calidad, también multisectorial, donde en una misma mesa se han sentado el sector público, el sector privado e incluso organismos internacionales a hacer una especie como de observatorio o veeduría a la política educativa. Esto existe también desde 2012. Y eso responde, de hecho, a más de un 80% de los seguimientos que hace el propio pacto educativo en la República Dominicana. Entonces, digamos que con esto veo que hay las bases, hay el noviazgo, digamos, para que se pueda hacer un futuro matrimonio entre PPP más sólidas en el sector. Así lo veo y nada, eso es lo que quería compartir con ustedes.
Gracias.
Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you to the organizers, Fundación Global, for inviting me here today. Thank you to the other sponsors of the event. Very interesting, the conversation, very interesting applications and potentially in the education sector. For my few minutes, I would like to broaden the perspective of our conversation a little bit. I agree with what Krishnan had said earlier about the risks, also the importance of modifying contracts and improving them. But I would like to kind of reframe the discussion a little bit, thinking about why are public-private partnerships important to begin with. And I think you mentioned this when we looked at the trillions of dollars that are needed to meet the SDGs by 2030. And we all recognize that we're already behind. So really, this is a race to the finish line, if you want, and these are the hardest miles to run. We've had great progress in reducing poverty, improving maternal health and child well-being in the world under the Millennium Development Goals. But now we're in the last mile of many of those challenges. You know, the last billion people without electricity, you know, the 3 out of 10 people who don't have access to water, the people who don't have access to clean sanitation. And that's going to require a collaborative effort of many different parties. So I would begin by saying, in order to reach those ambitious goals, added to which we have climate change and the investments required, we should really broaden our perspective on PPPs. I think we do have to include health. We do have to look at education. We do have to look at other sectors, training. These are areas where you can involve PPPs, and I would put all the cautions that you raised to the matter on the table, but I think we have to address those issues. Because if we don't address them, then we're not going to reach the SDGs in 2030. But then I would broaden the discussion even further and say it's not simply those investments by the private sector for public good. That is what a PPP is traditionally viewed as. But it's when we use public policy to create new markets with private investment. And what I mean by that is when the public sector takes a decision to provide a benefit to a sector or to improve the activity in a sector, for example, tax credits for R&D, the ability to create a fintech market in a country requires regulations by the public sector. The ability to have green bonds requires public policy. And we've recently seen that the EU has issued its own green bond principles. These are critical elements of collaborating public and private in much the way you're talking about with the education sector. And if we add those on top, that's how we reach the trillions of dollars of private investment that will unlock some of the potential of reaching the SDGs. A few years ago, 2 years ago now, the Business Council for Sustainable Development wrote a paper called Better Business, Better World. You probably all know that, where they identified $12 trillion in business opportunities and cost savings, all related to the SDGs. Now, the private sector would love to take advantage of these opportunities, but it will require regulations to do that. So this is the other form of PPP I think we should discuss more broadly. And that will help get us a little closer to the goal. But at the end of the day, it's a financing challenge, and I think we all recognize that. If we look at the gap, the 2.5 trillion that everyone talks about, I think we should be very upfront about the fact that the majority of that will come from the public sector. 60% of that, UNDP estimates, will be public sector financing. So we're really looking at a $1 trillion gap, if you want to put it in those terms, for developing economies under the SDG framework. A note I recently did looking at private investment in emerging markets already finds that there is $1 trillion of private investment every year, buying government securities, making investments in firms, doing FDI. On top of which, if you add remittances, about $400 billion, these exceed overseas development assistance by several multiples. So again, it's clear that we have to mobilize that private sector finance and direct it more and more to SDG topics. That's the challenge I think that we face, and that's why PPPs are so well thought of as one instrument, but only one instrument to help us achieve that. So the challenge then is, if that money from the private sector is going into emerging markets, where does it go? It typically goes to middle income or upper lower income countries, meaning it goes where the markets are more favorable. What's needed are the reforms at the local level to improve their ability to adapt or take advantage of this private capital. There's over $200 trillion in the global capital markets. We know that there's $81 billion or trillion of funds that have already signed on to the principles of responsible investment. These are investors who could potentially be mobilized to work in these markets. The green bond market will reach $1 trillion in a few years, and the impact investing market we're already seeing is focusing on emerging markets. And recently, the RISE fund went through its second round of fundraising and raised $2 billion for private equity that will be tied to the SDGs. And I'll be the first to admit these are green shoots of efforts. These are not full solutions yet, but they're the beginnings of a new tendency to build out these markets. But as I mentioned, bringing this money to the poorest and the most disadvantaged is the challenge. And that's where we have to look at blended finance. And you'll recognize also in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, it mentions concessional finance. And blended finance is exactly how do you measure and use public funds and private funds together to leverage investments in areas where they wouldn't go otherwise. This is a whole topic of conversation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I think it's an important one to signal here. That if we can find the right mechanisms and the right approaches and decide how and when we use blended finance, we can leverage a lot more private sector money going into these markets. So I'm left with the question, if this is so apparent, if the need is so great, if we all understand the challenge, why isn't it happening? And I have a personal opinion. I don't want to ascribe this to my firm, but I think there's a huge lack of trust among all the parties involved in these discussions. I go to many, many conferences and I'll see private sector talking to private sector. I go to many conferences and I'll see the government talking to the government, but I rarely see the government talking to the private sector. And that means there's a gap in terms of their understanding of the issues. And if you look at the trust barometer that Rick Edelman puts out every year around the World Economic Forum, we see it quite plainly. Globally, people do not trust public institutions. They don't trust the media, and they barely trust the private sector and NGOs a little bit more. But the trend has been down across all regions. And this is true in Latin America as it is in many other areas. And the fundamental principle of a public-private partnership is it's based on trust. When I call my Uber with my phone, I have trust that the contract will be recognized, the person will have a safe car, I'll get where I want to go, and that's why I do that. If I don't have that trust, this no longer becomes a ride-calling tool. So I think it's a fundamental issue that we have to look at, and we do have to confront the issue of corruption. Corruption is what has eroded part of this trust. In the European Union, they estimate $120 billion is lost every year among the European Union countries to corruption. In emerging markets, it's 10 times that number. What could we do with $1.2 trillion tomorrow? We could do a lot. So I think we have to start recalibrating how we build trust back into this model. How do we build trust among the different parties that have to be engaged? And I think you pointed out the People First UN PPP proposal. That's a good start. I would say we have to start looking at different mechanisms. The principles for responsible banking just came out. Those are also a good indicator. The Equator principles have been with us for 15 years. But I think we have to go further. What I think is needed is for governments to start writing in social and environmental contracts into their PPPs that citizens can understand and accept, and have quality standards that citizens will recognize as in their favor. Because once citizens turn against PPPs, there's no going back. And it's incumbent on governments to take the lead here because the private sector can't do it on its own. It's very similar to the issue of technology being embedded in infrastructure, which is another discussion. But today, more and more, 5G is going to change the whole nature of infrastructure with the Internet of Things. But the private sector won't propose that if it's not in the procurement notice that they receive asking them to embed that technology. So if the government doesn't say, do my stakeholder engagement, build community involvement, make sure that you're hiring women, make sure that you're improving the lives of indigenous populations, I'm not going to build that into my bid because I will be uncompetitive otherwise. So I think it's incumbent on governments to take a lead here. And I do think we can take some small steps. Let's start with smaller projects in the low-income countries where there is no trust. Let's start with things like changing streetlights to LED, where the cost savings are so obvious, they're cash flows that we can sell bonds against and raise debt against. Let's take the health system. Since we want to have a universal health care as part of SDG number 3, let's build out a system where we take pieces of the health system, the primary care, training, other things, and we use private-public partnerships to build those. Let's not try to do the whole system at once. And let's build those baby steps up. And let's even break down the design, build, finance, operate, and maintain model and say the government can take the design, build, and finance part, and private sector can take the operation and maintenance model. And then over time, we can build that into lease contracts or concession contracts that allow them to do even more. And so my final point would be those are ways of building up trust. But we also have to build up markets. And that's the even bigger challenge. And that's where we really begin to move the meter, I would say. We're looking at emerging markets today with the potential to leapfrog developed countries. Here I'm thinking of cell phones. There's one cell phone for every person in the world. In fact, there's more than one for everyone in the world, because someone here has 2 at least. That means we now have mobile payments and mobile banking in emerging markets. They're the biggest adopters of anybody. China and the emerging markets are the biggest adopters, and that's not US, it's not Europe. We have the potential for electronic or electric vehicles. The beneficiaries will be the Caribbean, where they're dependent on fuel imports and they're subject to hurricane risks, which knocks out their supplies. They're the ones who can use the battery storage from electric vehicles more effectively. We talk about the use of drones. That's already taking place in Africa to deliver medical supplies to remote areas. But each of these topics raises regulatory concerns. How can I conserve my privacy when I'm using my cell phone? I have to have very strict regulations around that. And then the government can use that data to help target public sector services. What happens when we adopt an electric vehicle transport system and I don't have any fuel taxes anymore? The government has to have regulations and rules so that it can maintain its fiscal responsibility in that kind of change. And even thinking about drones, now the airspace in cities will become a right or an asset that can be sold, but it has to be regulated. So I guess my summary is that if we broaden our scope and our aperture of our discussion, we can see there are numerous and limitless possibilities for public-private partnerships, both in the concrete building out of infrastructure, but also in the building out of markets. And I think the 3 critical elements that we've all sort of mentioned in our discussions is you have to have the right institutions, you have to find the right instruments, and you have to be innovative. And I think if we do those 3 things, we can bring the investment that's needed to reach the SDGs by 2030.
Thank you for all these very, very insightful commentary. I'm going to give Krishnan an opportunity to make a comment on any of the comments he's heard, and then we'll take 2 questions from the audience.
Thank you very much. And I found all the presentations extremely interesting. And I agree, we should not just restrict, because PPPs have been shown to be more successful in economic infrastructure. That doesn't mean we should restrict it to them. We should also explore its viability in other areas. I also accept that, a lot of the SDGs, a lot of the critical finance will need to come from the public sector, the importance of public finance. But public finance on its own, as we agree, is not going to be sufficient. So we need to explore then how can we sort of leverage in private finance. And I think there are like two or three critical issues here. They're both interrelated issues, but they also should be seen as distinct in some ways. The first one is, how do we increase the available supply of long-term finance and investment for sustainable development? And here we come into a lot of issues. We come into incentives issues, we come into regulatory issues, we come into long-term benchmarks, we come into even credit rating agencies. I mean, the tenure that they take to assess projects. We come into a lot of incentive issues, firstly. So how do we increase the availability of long-term finance and investment? Linked to that is the second issue. How do you effectively channel that money to where it is most needed? And here we come into innovative instruments, blended finance, risk-sharing tools, platforms, and so forth. We also come into also a point that a very valid point that you made, Martin, about the investment climate, also corruption and so forth, having an enabling investment climate. And then the third issue, it could be subsumed into the second issue, but the third issue is also important. I mean, how do you ensure that investment maximizes its impact? And there are 2 or 3 important points here. The one point is also externalities. I mean, the important fact that we need to find ways to better internalize externalities. I mean, to ensure that money flows, impactful money flows, and that money is competitive with other investments which may not have flown into that. So internalizing externalities. We need to find ways of strengthening reporting, finding ways of harmonizing standards and so forth. So I would say when looking at sort of financing the SDGs, that could be an overall framework that we should look at. Recently, the Secretary General on the 16th of October is going to announce, in fact, an alliance of 30 CEOs called Global Investors for Sustainable Development, who in particular are going to look at those areas, looking at ways how one can unblock the obstacles to scaling long-term finance for sustainable development. Thank you.
Before I turn it over to the audience, I have a quick question to the panel, if I may. 2 nights ago, at a private sector meeting between the presidents of the Pacific Alliance, so Colombia, Chile, Mexico, and Peru, the main topic of discussion, which really floored me, was on the 4th Industrial Revolution. So 5G, tech, artificial intelligence. It wasn't education, it wasn't infrastructure, it wasn't the usual topics, it was that. Packed audience, businessmen. How does this interest on the 4th Industrial Revolution, how does that tie into PPPs? And what's the time?
I'll take a stab at that. I think it is the big elephant in the room, in a way. There's a lot of fear around the 4th Industrial Revolution, clearly, in terms of its impact on jobs. But I think it's, to use another analogy, the horse is already out of the barn. So it's a question of how do we capture the value of that new capacity around AI, around robotics, around the Internet of Things, to actually drive value and allow us to measure the impact of what we're doing. So in the infrastructure sector, we see it quite clearly that with the rise of electric vehicles and, more importantly, autonomous vehicles, it's going to change the face of the way we transport and do logistics globally. And this means we'll have more data about where goods are, we'll have more data about where demand is, and we'll actually be able to deliver our supplies in a more effective and efficient way. I think the development world, the world of developing economies, is going to have to adapt to that very quickly. Because if they don't, this is sort of like the plane leaving the airport. You can't catch it. You may be able to catch a train if you run out of the station, but you won't catch the plane once it's left. And I think it's incumbent on us to find ways of embedding that, as I was suggesting earlier, in the PPP contracts, so you can take advantage of this high-end technology. But I would like to point out one fact. The typical story you hear is that all of this is displacing labor. But I would look at the world in a slightly different way. Developed economies are losing labor right now. They're aging. Their workforces are declining. And Japan is a perfect example of this. They really only have 3 options. 1, they're already doing, they're engaging women more actively in the workforce. 2, they're allowing more people in as immigrants with qualified skills. And 3, they have to improve their productivity. That's the 4th Industrial Revolution. So where does that impact in developing economies, which have lots of labor? Well, it impacts them very directly on universal health coverage. The one biggest gap right now to delivering health to everyone is workers, trained nurses and trained doctors. And artificial intelligence and robotics and all the systems that will be developed can help plug that gap. In fact, we won't be able to do it just by training more people. So I think we have to be more and more creative about how we use this technology, and we have to apply it to those sectors that will have the greatest impact, both in helping people improve their lives and also in expanding our productivity.
Sí, La pregunta es muy interesante y las PPPs al final tienen que adaptarse a las necesidades que la sociedad tiene en cada momento. No son independientes de ellas. No podemos ver las PPPs, creo que es un error ver el modelo PPP asociado a carreteras porque se ha aplicado mucho en carreteras. El modelo PPP es un modelo que tiene que ser utilizado para aquellos aspectos que el sector privado no puede hacer por sí mismo y por lo tanto necesita un incentivo del sector público. Hablamos antes, por ejemplo, de los objetivos del desarrollo sostenible. El problema del objetivo de ese desarrollo sostenible es que no le podemos pedir al sector privado, cuyo objetivo es ganar dinero, que los haga como una NGO. Necesitamos esos incentivos y esos incentivos quien los tiene que crear adecuadamente es el sector público. Y ahí es donde está la clave que tenemos que ver las PPPs. Es decir, las PPPs es un mecanismo que en cada momento nos ayuda a lograr los objetivos que queremos lograr, ¿no? Y relacionándolo con todo lo que se llama la nueva revolución industrial, la cuarta revolución industrial, puede entrar de muchas maneras, ¿no? Por un lado, las PPPs crearán los incentivos adecuados porque al final se centran en los resultados finales para que el sector privado incorpore esa nueva tecnología y sea más eficiente. Por otro lado, donde existan fallos de mercado, puede apoyar con dinero público, con ayuda pública, o puede establecer incentivos adecuados para que un determinado país empiece a adoptar esas tecnologías, las traiga de otros países, desarrolle un equipo. Entonces, todo eso al final lo que depende es de dos aspectos. Por un lado, del identificar cuáles son los objetivos correctos y, en el segundo lugar, de diseñar el modelo de participación público-privada que traslade los incentivos de manera adecuada. Entonces, en ese sentido, yo creo que son perfectamente compatibles, ¿no? Y que es necesario dejar de ver las PPPs como algo asociado a grandes proyectos de infraestructura solamente, sino que puede ser utilizado para cualquier aspecto que el sector público quiera empujar en aras de mejorar la sociedad.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Avila, and I work with an international bank, basically covering banking security, anti-bribery and corruption for Africa and Middle East. Excellent, excellent presentation, and I couldn't agree more. The PPP model can no longer be only tied to social impact. One of the things that banking and under the new social responsibility we're trying to push is seeking more markets that will offer trust, transparency, and that guarantee of no reputational risk. Because that's one of the biggest exposures that any public listed organization and who owes legal liability to both UK and US banking regulators, we're constantly exposing ourselves to. You know, how can we help, how can we support the developing world without being under the scrutiny of a politically exposed, corrupt leader, for example? So there's plenty of alternative projects that we could implement, support developing countries, but where is the insurance from public leadership that would be a positive partnership? So I would like to hear your views on that.
I would say that you clearly have to look at the institutionality of the country that you're dealing with and see how serious they are about the policies. So one thing is you look at the policy trajectory over time and you see how they've been consistently implementing that. Chile is a good example if you want to have one in the region. You would look for things like, do they have a PPP unit that's trained and in the issue and know exactly how to deal with that? Do they have capital markets players who are local, maybe pension funds that can invest in this? Because the best hedge you have against risk in local currency is local currency funding. So what we're looking at is the pension funds in Africa. They're $800 billion now in Africa. And the Development Bank of South Africa is using its own funds to invest in infrastructure. That's the way it should be done. Taking currency risk is another additional risk that you would like to avoid. So you would look at the maturity of capital markets. And then I think you have to be very clear up front, and I think Jose mentioned it, you have to have an exit strategy. And this is something public sector doesn't usually think about, and the private sector always thinks about. But I think it's good to have that conversation up front. What is the worst case here? What will we do in that case? And if you don't have that discussion up front, it's not going to be a happy marriage. So I think those are the kinds of ways you identify trust and you build it on a practical level. with your partners. I know it's not concrete measures, but I think there's things that you can start to see in the region. And I would just point out that the region now has PPP units. The infrascope, if you look at that in Latin America, identifies most countries have these units, and they're also starting to incorporate economic and social principles within their PPP contracts. So Latin America is getting it. I think right now we're suffering a hangover from the corruption scandals, which were very widespread, and people are a little bit reluctant to move back in the market. But once we see growth coming back, I think you'll see some of that trust being rebuilt.
Sorry, Ottaviano Canuto, Brookings. Just two small comments. One, to reinforce the reference that there is no contraposition between basic traditional infrastructure and Industry 4.0. On the contrary, for AI, robotics, Internet of Things to yield to micro manufacturing in the hope that the region might have, for instance, in moving up the ladder, you have to have the basic provision of energy as well as telecommunication and so on. So this idea that we can evade the traditional economy by jumping to Industry 4.0 is wrong. We have to do the homework first, and we're going to pay the price if we don't do it. And second point I'd like to make is that, of course, PPP is still a broad, generic definition, given the fact that what matters for success in most cases is a clear demarcation of responsibilities so that the structure of incentives is not blurred. And that will lead to different demarcation of responsibilities. There, depending on the sectors, there are areas where the public sector is more capable of managing risks and everything else. So there is no abstract formula that can be implemented everywhere. But the most important thing is demarcation of responsibilities and incentives.
Thank you very much.
Yo soy Liliana Mesías, colombiana, y mi pregunta, trabajo temas de seguridad y de justicia. Y mi pregunta es en relación precisamente de los PPP, digamos, articulados a los temas de justicia, si ustedes conocen buenas prácticas, no solamente en América Latina, sino a nivel del mundo, en relación con estos servicios. Y no hablo de infraestructura, sino básicamente del servicio que se presta, por ejemplo, en los centros penitenciarios o en materia de seguridad. Y cuál es la opinión que ustedes tienen acerca de los bonos de impacto social.
Bueno, voy a responder a tu primera pregunta. La segunda, la de los bonos de impacto social, lo dejo para Martín o cualquiera. La respuesta es que para cualquier servicio público es posible, en la mayoría de ellos, encontrar sistemas de participación público-privada que funcionen correctamente, ¿no? Por ejemplo, se me ocurre en el ámbito penitenciario de prisiones hay varios casos, ¿no? Uno de ellos es muy interesante conocer el caso chileno. En este sentido, es clave en este tipo de contratos de aspecto social definir qué responsabilidades tienen que quedar en manos del sector privado y qué responsabilidades tienen que quedar en manos del sector público, que es fundamental. Por ejemplo, en el caso de las prisiones en Chile, por así decir, existe un responsable de gendarmería, que es la Policía de Prisiones de Chile, pero luego hay un responsable de la concesión, en este caso del proyecto de PPP, cuyo cometido es un cometido ligado a aquellos aspectos que no tienen que ver necesariamente con la seguridad, sino, por ejemplo, pues con la limpieza, con la construcción, con la alimentación de los reclusos, ¿no? La ventaja que tiene ese modelo PPP es que permite, a través de una serie de incentivos, valorar adecuadamente que el sector privado está dando el servicio que se espera que ofrezca, ¿no? Pues, por ejemplo, ellos tienen una supervisión de cómo es la alimentación, tiene que tener unas cualidades de calorías, tiene que tener una limpieza determinada, y esa es una de las grandes ventajas del modelo PPP frente al no modelo PPP. Con un modelo PPP, el sector público tiene argumentos para fiscalizar y controlar que el sector privado está haciendo las cosas correctamente. En el caso del sector público, y eso me lo comentaban a mí en una entrevista en Chile, ¿no? Dicen, lo peor de las cárceles públicas es que el sector público, al controlarse a sí mismo, al final no hace las cosas bien, porque no tiene incentivos a hacerlas bien, ¿no? Junto con eso es clave determinar qué aspectos debe tener control el sector público, y en estos proyectos de carácter social es fundamental, porque la seguridad sigue siendo pública, porque hay muchos aspectos de responsabilidad pública en los que el sector privado no va a añadir ningún valor. Y por eso es fundamental llevar a cabo los estudios correctos, con anticipación, basándose en las experiencias anteriores, para diseñar correctamente cómo deben ser esas estructuras, ¿no?
I could comment a little on social impact bonds. I think it's a very interesting area, and it suffers from all the same maladies that public-private partners suffer from, because you're engaging a government who's paying for success. You're bringing in a private sector provider. Often it's an NGO. You have someone who's paying the money up front, who's the funder, and then you have the beneficiaries and the tracking of the outcomes. But having said that, it's a very interesting model because it does bring together all the parties. They're very contract heavy, but when they work, it provides real evidence of impact. And we know that this has been done successfully in the education sector. The Rajasthan Educate Girls project in India is one that had quite a degree of success, showing that with the flexibility of implementation, which is built into the model, they were able to calibrate education, not only to raise the educational scores of girls, but those of boys. We've seen it similarly in Australia, where my firm has worked very closely with the governments of New South Wales and elsewhere on foster children, making sure that foster children go back to their parents as soon as possible, and also building a small bond around that where success is returning children to their homes. We've had other examples in the case of prisons with recidivism that have been less successful, I would argue, but also are experimental. So the takeaway on social impact bonds for me is this. They're very useful as a way of piloting a new approach to a sector, but they're very difficult to scale. And that's where they often come a cropper. So recently, Gordon Brown and Serrano Cohen have set up something called the Education Outcomes Initiative, focusing on sub-Saharan Africa and the training issue and education issue of young Africans. We're going to have tens of millions of youth entering the workforce over the next decades in Africa. In fact, 90% of population growth over the next decades is in Africa. And they have to have jobs. But if they're not educated, they're not going to be able to take advantage of the fourth industrial revolution or any other revolution that might be taking place in the future. So they're trying to focus a $1 billion fund on scaling up sustainable impact bonds in that region. And if they do, it'll be the first time you've seen an aggregation of social impact bonds at a large and global scale. But I would say it's a useful pilot approach, but it hasn't yet shown that it can reach the scale that we would like.
Me disculpo, sé que hay muchas preguntas más, pero me he sobrepasado por 20 minutos. Me acompañan a felicitar y agradecer los panelistas hoy día. Muchas gracias.